this analysis, we will be focusing on macroeconomic policies in Latin American high-income countries. Before we turn to our representatives, let us focus on what make Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay high-income countries in this region.
A high-income country is defined by the World Bank as a country with a gross national income per capita above $12,400 in 2015. By this definition, all three of our represented countries today classify as high income. As can be seen, all three countries have experienced impressive economic growth in terms of GDP, GNI, and GDP per capita. Furthermore, relative to other Latin American economies, education in all three countries is at a high level. Employment up till recently has been high, and industries have grown exponentially in the last century.
Turning to our representatives, Maria, before we move to the current crisis, can you explain what was the Brazilian Workers' Party's economic policies and some of the economic benefits it brought to Brazil?
Well, when Lula became president in 2002, he planned to further increase neo-structuralist policies, which had already begun to be implemented. The Plano Real, which had been put in place in 1993 by Cardoso, following a period of hyperinflation, brought in a new and stable currency. This, as well as a well-timed commodity boom, allowed for continuous increase in Brazilian exports. Social policies took the foreground on government action in the economy. The implementation of a minimum wage boosted domestic consumption, further increasing GDP. However, the most noticeable effect of neo-structuralist policies in Brazil has been the extreme alleviation of poverty, which was cut by 2/3 since the Bolsa Família project was put in place. Half of Brazil's 2 million population is now middle class.
So where did neo-structuralism go wrong?
Well, in 2012, 38% of GDP took the form of government spending. Although there were programs to help the poverty line, there was not enough investment in infrastructure, making production costs very high and turning away a lot of foreign direct investment. Furthermore, Brazil spent 11.3% of GDP on pensions, which is 3 times more than it should have been, considering its young demographic. This money could have been better spent on their poor education system, which is taking quite a toll on the productivity level. 3/4 of Brazil's growth in the last decade has come from adding workers and not from productivity increase. Overall, the increase in government spending on these social programs has led to an enormous budget deficit of 2.7% of GDP on the current account. Lastly, the economic recession, which has continuously worsened over the past 2 years, has increased unemployment to 12% in 2016.
Very informative, Maria. How is Temer going to change the macroeconomic policies in Brazil for the future?
As a more right-wing politician, Temer has announced that he will be focusing heavily on reducing the budget deficit, which is currently at 10% of GDP. This will mean that government spending will decrease to an extent, and he has made it clear that he will reform labor and pension laws, as well as make infrastructure and investment more attractive to private firms and foreign investors. Other policy reforms will include privatization, deregulation, and fiscal discipline. For example, a bill to open deep-sea oil fields to private investment is making its way through Congress. Many of these policies may remind people of the neoliberal days.
So Tara, can you tell us why Chile is considered the economic miracle of neoliberalism?
In the 70s, it became clear that ISI had failed. It had left Chile with a massive inflation, while its balance of payments and vulnerability problems were still not yet to be fixed. In the political chaos resulting, General Pinochet took over through a military coup. To undermine the political influence of the labor unions, Pinochet was convinced by the Chicago Boys to adopt an economic model featuring a rightist shrunken state and extreme free market capitalism, making Chile the first Latin American country to adopt neoliberal policies. Their radical policy changes had a strong negative impact on the unemployment rates, and the Chileans depending on government subsidies and price controls. Yet, while other leaders of other countries succumbed under the cries of their people and partly retracted their neoliberal policy, Pinochet did not. Many researchers state this as Chile's unique characteristics to become the economic miracle. Pinochet's dictatorship allowed the neoliberal policies to evolve beyond the shock period and to yield positive results. As a result, Chile is the only country in Latin America that had experienced a substantial increase in income per capita through neoliberal.
And why the move to neo-structuralism?
As mentioned, Chile experienced a significant rise in income per capita through neoliberalism. However, the miracle Chile did not entail an increase in social development, as inequality and poverty remained high. From 1990 onwards, we see that Chile mixes the basic framework of the neoliberal agenda and the market-oriented economic programs with programs focused more on equity and democracy. Labor rights are restored, social spending increases, and capital controls are once again introduced. As a result, Chile's economic policy now starts to reflect neo-structuralism. In 2016, Chile seems to still follow this track, as President Bachelet introduced free education, tax reforms to better finance social programs, and a new democratic constitution last year. As Chile's main export, copper, is declining in prices, it is interesting to see how Chile will continue to uphold its expenditures for social programs in the following years, and if neo-structuralist policies are even being implemented again, as we see that Bachelet's approval rates are really low at this moment.
So what type of economic policies are governed by Uruguay?
Uruguay had an early development of social and labor legislation. In the 1950s, there was a prominence of the middle classes, as well as adherence to the constitutional and liberal forms of government. These achievements were exceptional for this time. The country applied, and is nowadays still applying, redistribution of income in order to secure a high level of social consensus. Bautismo is a strategy that developed in Uruguay in the 1950s. The strategy meant that the best way to solve differences in society was by creating an interventionist state to regulate the imbalance of society and to work for a more equitable distribution of wealth. It emphasizes political awareness among the population. Nowadays, the country still has a high institutional stability. This is reflected in a high level of confidence that citizens have on the government.
And how has Uruguay implemented the strategy of ISI?
At the beginning of the Great Depression, Uruguay had to deal with balance of payments difficulties, and it decided to take the path of import substitution. This strategy had been above average successful in the case of Uruguay. This is for a large part due to the products of which the country was able to produce at low cost for the world demand. Products like meat, wool and other animal products contributed to a high economic growth, and this was reinforced by the high ratio of the value of export to population. The strategy was used until 1973, and it had contributed to growth until the mid-1950s. In 1973, a military government assumed power and aimed to revitalize the economy by re-emphasizing exports. After this year, until now, Uruguay had been very export-oriented and stuck to neo-structural policies. The export products were shifted towards more sophisticated goods, like electrical appliances, transport equipment, and non-metallic minerals. Investments in new technologies increased and labor productivity increased rapidly. Export markets have been diversified in order to reduce the country's dependency on its main trade partners. Nowadays, 77% of exports go to 15 different destinations.
So as we can see, overall there is not one macroeconomic policy which suits every high-income country perfectly. In practice, countries need to adapt to circumstances and the current economic context in which they find themselves to figure out which policy suits them. In the face of an economic crisis, Timur is pushing for more neoliberal policies and austerity measures in order to see if the economy can stabilize itself. For Chile, on the other hand, we see that the neoliberal framework is mixed with social programs, and that Bachelet is still trying to continue this in her recent years in government. Uruguay has had a change of direction from applying ISI policies for decades toward market openness, and nowadays Uruguay is very export orientated. I'd like to thank our journalists and have a great evening. Thank you.